You know how sometimes, when you're quiet enough, you can almost hear the old stones of a church whispering, like they've seen so much, heard so many secrets, that they just can't keep them all in. That's how it feels when Grandfather talks about the old monastery, St. Agnes of the Fields, the one that stands all gray and lonely up on the hill. It's mostly just ruins now, with ivy crawling all over it like a green blanket. But Grandfather says it was once alive with prayers, and chants and secrets that were heavier than any bell. And the heaviest secret of all, he says, belonged to a young nun named Sister Agnes. Imagine a time, so long ago, when the world was much bigger and much scarier than it is now. There weren't many towns, and travel was slow, and the forests felt deeper, like they were always watching you. And in the middle of all that, people believed in God with all their hearts, or at least they pretended to. Monasteries and convents were like little islands of peace, or so they seemed from the outside. But Grandfather says even holy places can hide dark corners. Sister Agnes was just a girl, barely older than my big sister when she was sent to the convent. She wasn't one of those stern old nuns with faces carved from stone. She had eyes, Grandfather says, like a startled fawn, big and brown and full of a quiet wonder. She'd probably spent her childhood chasing butterflies or listening to the wind in the fields, not thinking about stone walls and endless prayers. But her family was poor, and putting a daughter in the convent was a way to ensure she was fed, clothed, and, most importantly, saved. They thought they were doing the right thing. The convent itself wasn't grand. It was built of rough gray stone, with narrow windows that let in only slivers of the cold light. Inside, it smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and the faint, ever-present scent of damp earth. The days were long and quiet, filled with the rhythmic hum of prayers, the scratch of quill on vellum in the scriptorium, and the gentle clatter of pottery in the kitchen. Sister Agnes, fresh from the sunlit fields, found the silence heavy, almost suffocating at first. She missed the laughter of children, the warmth of a hearth, the smell of freshly turned soil. But she was obedient, and she tried very hard to be a good nun, to learn the prayers, to follow the rules, to erase the world she had known before the thick oak doors clanged shut behind her. The Mother Superior, a woman named Eldrina, was as hard and unyielding as the granite bedrock the convent stood upon. Her voice was like dry leaves rustling, and her eyes missed nothing. She believed in strict discipline, in silence, in the constant battle against worldly temptation. She saw any spark of joy, any hint of individual spirit, as a sign of weakness, a crack in the spiritual armor. Sister Agnes, with her quiet thoughtfulness and her tendency to gaze out of the narrow windows at the birds flying free, was often a silent source of irritation for Mother Eldrina. One winter, colder than any in memory, a sickness swept through the nearby villages. It was a cough that turned into a burning fever, and then, slowly, a chilling stillness. The convent, usually isolated, felt the effects. Supplies dwindled. The sisters worked harder, tending the sick in their small infirmary, praying even longer, hours for the souls of the dying. Sister Agnes, despite her fear, worked tirelessly, her small hands gentle as she wiped fevered brows and offered sips of broth. She saw suffering up close, a kind of suffering that no prayer seemed able to touch, and it changed her. It softened her heart even as the world around her grew harder. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky and the wind howled around, the convent walls like a hungry wolf, a desperate knocking came at the heavy oak gate. It was unusual. Visitors rarely came after dark, especially in such weather. Mother Eldrina, her face grim, sent two of the stronger sisters to answer, armed, with a heavy bolt. Through the crack in the gate, they saw a figure huddled on the ground, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, shivering uncontrollably. It was a woman, barely conscious, clutching something to her chest. She was pale, her lips blue, and she coughed weakly, a thin, rattling sound. But what truly startled them was the small, bundled shape she clutched. A baby. Tiny. Swaddled in. Rough cloth. Its face a mottled red from the cold, but alive. Mother Eldrina stood over the woman, her face impassive. "Who are you, child, and what brings you to our holy house in such a state?" Her voice was stern, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps concern, in her eyes. The woman struggled to speak, her voice a reedy whisper. "Please, Mother, my baby, she's sick. The fever, it took my husband, everyone. I could not save her." Her words dissolved into a fit of coughing, and she collapsed completely, the baby slipping from her weakening grasp. Sister Agnes, who had been watching from a respectful distance, felt a sudden, powerful urge. Without thinking, she stepped forward, kneeling beside the fallen woman. She reached out, her hand hovering over the tiny, shivering bundle. The baby let out a small, weak cry. Mother Eldrina's voice snapped, sharp and cold. "Sister Agnes, step back. This is not your concern. Sister Martha, Sister Bridget, take the woman and the infant to the infirmary, carefully. We must ascertain their condition." Sister Agnes hesitated, her eyes fixed on the tiny baby. It was so small, so helpless. She wanted to reach out, to touch it, to offer warmth. But Mother Eldrina's gaze was like ice, pinning her in place. She reluctantly obeyed, stepping back, her heart aching. The woman and child were carried away, leaving a lingering scent of damp wool and sickness in the cold air. The heavy gate was bolted shut, the sounds of the wind once more the only noise. That night, Sister Agnes could not sleep. She lay on her hard pallet in the dormitory, listening to the soft snores of the other sisters, but her mind was wide awake, filled with the image of the pale woman and the tiny crying infant. She thought of the cold, the hunger, the desperation that must have driven them to the convent gate in such a storm. In the deepest hours of the night when the convent was utterly silent, save for the distant chime of the hour bell, a soft, almost imperceptible cough reached her ears from the direction of the infirmary, then another, and another, weaker now. A terrible premonition settled in her heart. She crept from her pallet, moving silently through the dark dormitory, her bare feet cold on the stone floor. She knew it was forbidden to leave her bed during the night hours, but an irresistible pull, a need to know, guided her. She reached the infirmary door, a heavy wooden slab, and pushed it open just a crack. A single lantern cast flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. Sister Martha, the infirmarian, sat by the bed where the woman lay. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking, and beside her on a small makeshift bed lay the tiny bundle. Still, utterly, terribly still. Sister Agnes felt a cold wave wash over her, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She knew with a devastating certainty what it meant. The woman, the baby, they were both gone. The sickness, the cold, the desperation had claimed them, just like so many others in the villages. But then, as Sister Martha lifted a corner of the swaddling cloth, Sister Agnes saw something that made her heart leap into her throat, a gasp caught in her chest. The baby, though terribly still, had a small, intricately carved wooden bird clutched tightly in its tiny hand. It was a common toy, often given to children in the villages, but there was something about this one, perhaps the delicate carving of its wings, that made it unique. And then, just as Sister Martha was about to gently close the cloth over the infant's face, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the baby's small body. A whisper of movement, a ghost of a breath. Sister Agnes's eyes widened. She had seen it. A tiny spark. The baby was not gone. Not yet. It was clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Sister Martha, oblivious, began to intone the last rites, her voice choked with grief. She believed the child was dead, her tiny, fragile life extinguished by the cold and the sickness. But Aura had seen. She had witnessed the miracle of a dying spark refusing to be put out. A secret, terrible knowledge blossomed within her. She knew, with absolute certainty, that if no one intervened, if no one fought for that flicker of life, it would soon be gone forever. And she also knew that defying Mother Eldrina, revealing this fragile secret, would bring down the full wrath of the convent upon her head, perhaps even excommunication. But how could she let a life slip away, knowing she had seen its last, desperate flicker? The cold stone walls of the infirmary seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the unspoken forbidden truth she now held. The chill in the infirmary was deeper than the winter air outside. It was the cold of a tiny, fading life. Sister Agnes stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the small bundle, on that barely perceptible tremor. Sister Martha, her back to Agnes, continued, her low murmur of prayers for the dead, her voice thick with sorrow. The single lantern cast long, dancing shadows that made the still figures seem even more ghostly. Every instinct in Agnes screamed at her to act, to speak, to stop the solemn ritual before it was too late. But the rules of the convent, the unyielding authority of Mother Eldrina, were like iron chains around her. Disobedience was a grave sin, especially in such a sacred place. And to interrupt a death rite? It was unthinkable. Yet the image of that tiny, struggling breath, that whisper of life, burned in her mind. It was a spark, fragile as a spiderweb in the wind. But it was there. She remembered the warmth of her own family's hearth, the fierce grip of her mother's hand, the way her little brother's chest rose and fell in sleep. This baby was someone's child, clinging to life. How could she stand by and let it simply fade? Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a silent step forward, then another, moving towards the small makeshift bed. Sister Martha, lost in her prayers, didn't notice. Agnes knelt beside the bundle, her breath held in her chest. The air was thick with the scent of sickness and the faint, sweet smell of death that lingered even in the cleanest infirmary. She reached out a trembling hand, slowly, carefully, towards the swaddling cloth. Just as her fingers brushed the rough fabric, Sister Martha straightened with a weary sigh, her prayers concluded. "May God have mercy on their souls," she murmured, her voice raspy with grief. She turned to fetch a clean shroud, her back once more to Agnes and the infant. This was it. Her chance, or her doom. With a sudden desperate surge of courage, Agnes leaned closer to the tiny face, her own breath a warm puff against the cold skin. She saw it again, the faint, shallow rise and fall of the chest. It was there, a whisper, but a breath. Nonetheless, she had to be sure. She lowered her ear, pressing it gently against the small chest. A faint, irregular thump, like a butterfly's wing against a window pane. A heartbeat, weak but present. Her heart leaped. The baby was alive. She straightened, her mind racing. How could she explain? Sister Martha believed the child was dead. Mother Eldrina would be furious at her disobedience, at her intrusion, at the very idea that she, a young, inexperienced nun, could contradict the solemn judgment of the infirmarian. The consequences could be severe: harsh penance, solitary confinement, perhaps even public humiliation before the entire convent. But the baby was alive. She took a deep breath. "Sister Martha?" Her voice came out as a desperate, reedy whisper, barely audible. Sister Martha turned, startled, her eyes widening as she saw Agnes kneeling by the bed. "Sister Agnes, what are you doing here? You know it is forbidden to be out of your pallet at this hour." Her voice was sharp, laced with tired authority. "And why are you disturbing the dead? Have you no respect?" Agnes ignored the reprimand, her gaze fixed on Sister Martha's face. "Sister Martha," she pleaded, her voice gaining a desperate urgency. "The baby. She lives. I saw a tremor. I felt a breath. I heard a heartbeat." Sister Martha stared at her, her eyes reflecting a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Sister Agnes, the child is gone. The cold claimed her. I have already said the final prayers. It is the will of God." Her voice softened slightly, laced with a weary pity. "Your grief, child, plays tricks on your eyes. Go back to your pallet." "No!" Agnes cried, her voice rising, losing its quiet meekness. "I swear to you, sister, she lives. Look closely. There." She pointed a trembling finger at the tiny chest, willing it to show another tremor, another whisper of life. "Sister." Martha, though clearly annoyed and disturbed, hesitated. The raw conviction in Agnes's voice, the desperate plea in her eyes, was hard to ignore. She sighed, a long, weary sound, and slowly, reluctantly, moved back to the small bed. She knelt, just as Agnes had, and peered closely at the infant. Her brow furrowed. She placed a hand carefully over the tiny mouth, feeling for a breath. Nothing. Then she lowered her ear to the chest, just as Agnes had done. The silence in the infirmary stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the lantern wick and the pounding of Agnes's own heart. She watched Sister Martha's face, searching for any sign, any flicker of recognition. For a long moment, there was nothing. Martha's expression remained grim, unconvinced. Agnes's hope began to dwindle, a cold dread replacing it. Had she imagined it? Had the precious spark finally gone out? Then Sister Martha's eyes widened. A sudden sharp intake of breath. Her head snapped up, her gaze locking with Agnes's, and in her eyes Agnes saw it, not disbelief, but a dawning, terrible realization. "By the saints above," Sister Martha whispered, her voice a shocked gasp. "You are right, there is a tremor, a heartbeat. Faint. So faint, but it is there." Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She looked from the living baby to Agnes, then around the stark infirmary as if seeing it for the first time. The gravity of the situation settled around them, heavy and suffocating. They had declared a living child dead, a grave error, a spiritual transgression in the eyes of the church, and a profound failure in their duty. "We must warm her, sister," Agnes urged, her voice trembling with a renewed, desperate energy. "Give her broth. She is so cold." Sister Martha nodded numbly, still reeling from the shock. Yes, of course, we must warm her, but Mother Eldrina—" Her voice trailed off, a note of fear entering it. The implications of this discovery were immense. To admit such a mistake, especially after the rites for the dead had been performed, would be a monumental blow to the authority of the Mother Superior and to the convent itself. It was a secret, a terrible, forbidden truth that now bound them. Both, Agnes understood. This wasn't just about saving a life. It was about concealing a grave error, about defying the rigid, unbending rules of their order. To reveal the baby was alive meant admitting they had almost buried a living child. It meant admitting Mother Eldrina's flawed judgment and Sister Martha's own oversight. But what choice did they have? To let the baby die now, when they knew it clung to life, would be a far greater sin. "We must save her, Sister Martha," Agnes stated, her voice firm, resolute. "And no one else must know. Not until she is stronger. We must keep her hidden." Sister Martha looked at Agnes, a complex mixture of fear, gratitude, and a shared, terrible burden in her eyes. The risk was immense. To hide a living child, to defy the Mother Superior directly, was a transgression that could lead to severe punishment, perhaps even expulsion from the order, a fate worse than death for a nun. But the baby's faint heartbeat, the undeniable flicker of life, was a powerful, silent plea that resonated deeper than any rule or fear. "Hidden?" Sister Martha whispered, her gaze darting towards the infirmary door, as if Mother Eldrina herself might appear at any moment. "How? Where?" Agnes thought quickly. The convent was a labyrinth of cold stone, but there were hidden nooks, forgotten corners. The old root cellar, unused for years, accessible only through a crumbling passage behind the main kitchen. It would be cold, damp, but safe, and most importantly, secret. She pictured it, the faint, earthy smell, the stacks of empty barrels. It was a dangerous, desperate plan. "The root cellar," Agnes said, her voice low and urgent. "Behind the old bread oven. It is rarely visited. We can keep her there just until she gains some strength. We will bring her broth, warm cloths. No one will know." Sister Martha hesitated for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the tiny, fragile life. The weight of the decision, the immense risk, pressed down on her. But then, a profound sense of duty, a flicker of true compassion that transcended the convent's rigid rules, seemed to win out. She let out a slow, shaky breath. "God forgive us," she whispered. "May He guide our hands. But if Mother Eldrina ever discovers this, we are lost, Sister Agnes. Utterly lost." Agnes nodded, her own heart still pounding, but a strange, fierce resolve filling her. They were stepping into forbidden territory, venturing beyond the strictures of their holy vows for the sake of a single, fragile life. It was a dangerous path, paved with secrecy and defiance. But looking at the small, almost translucent hand clutching the tiny wooden bird, she knew, with an absolute certainty, that it was the only path she could take. The convent, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and their secret, a ticking clock against the relentless pursuit of order and unquestioning obedience. How long could they hide a living, breathing secret within the very walls built to contain all human imperfection? The silent, cold stone watched, an ancient witness to their desperate, forbidden act of mercy. You know how sometimes, even when you're super careful, a secret feels like it's got its own little heartbeat, thumping louder and louder in the quiet? That's how it must have been for Sister Agnes and Sister Martha hiding that tiny baby. Grandfather says it was like the very stones of the convent were listening, ready to tell. The root cellar, though, was a good choice for a hiding spot. It was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the convent, behind the big, unused bread oven in the back kitchen. You had to push aside a heavy, damp tapestry, then unlatch a creaky wooden door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The air inside was heavy with the smell of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of potatoes that had rotted ages ago. It was cold, so cold that your breath misted in front of you, and darker than a winter night, even with the small, flickering lamp Sister Martha brought. They wrapped the baby, whom Agnes had quietly in her heart started calling Hope, in every warm scrap of cloth they could find. Old habits, discarded prayer shawls, even some of Agnes's own precious wool socks, all bundled around the tiny, shivering form. They fashioned a makeshift cradle out of a large, empty wine barrel, stuffing it with straw and more cloths to keep out the biting cold of the stone floor. It wasn't soft or grand like the cradles in the rich houses in town, but it was warm enough, or at least they prayed it was. The first few days were terrifying. Sister Agnes and Sister Martha moved like shadows, speaking only in whispers, their eyes constantly darting around, checking to see if anyone was watching, listening. Every cough from the baby, every tiny whimper sent a jolt of panic through them. They were always afraid that the sound would travel up through the thick stone, reach the ears of Mother Eldrina, whose hearing, Grandfather says, was sharper than a hunting hawk's. Sister Agnes, despite her exhaustion, volunteered for every kitchen chore that would take her near the root cellar entrance. While the other sisters were busy kneading dough or stirring pots of stew, she would slip away, her heart pounding, to check on Hope. She'd bring tiny sips of warm, watered-down broth, brewed from the few meager vegetables they had, trying to coax the baby to drink. Her hands, usually used for scrubbing floors or copying scripture, became gentle and nimble, learning the delicate art of feeding a fragile, fading life. Sister Martha, with her knowledge of herbs and ailments from her infirmary duties, would sneak in small pouches of dried chamomile to soothe the baby, or a tiny spoonful of honey mixed with water to give it strength. She was older, more cautious, and the fear of Mother Eldrina was a constant shadow in her eyes. But the spark of life in the baby, that tiny, defiant flutter, seemed to have rekindled something in Martha, too, a flicker of compassion that had perhaps been dulled by years of convent strictures. Their days became a tightrope walk of piety and deceit. They attended the morning prayers, the midday meals, the evening vespers, their faces serene, their voices blending with the chants. All the while their minds were occupied with the secret life hidden in the cellar. Agnes felt a strange, constant hum of fear and excitement. She was doing something wrong by the convent's rules, but she knew in her heart that it was profoundly right in God's eyes. This baby, saved from the brink of burial, was a tiny miracle entrusted to her. Mother Eldrina, however, was as observant as ever. She noticed Sister Agnes's frequent trips to the kitchen, her sudden attentiveness to chores that had once been assigned to others. She saw the new weariness in Sister Martha's eyes, the way she sometimes paused, lost in thought. But she saw these things through the lens of her own rigid beliefs. She assumed Agnes was indulging in some spiritual penance, perhaps flagellating herself for some perceived sin, and Martha was simply exhausted from the sickness that had swept through the villages. She grunted her approval at Agnes's new diligence, unwittingly sanctioning the very deception that was taking place under her nose. Weeks turned into a month. The winter, unyielding, continued its icy grip on the land. But slowly, miraculously, Hope began to gain strength. Her cries, once faint and desperate, grew a little louder, a little stronger. Her tiny fingers, which had barely clutched the wooden bird, now gripped Agnes's finger with surprising force. Her eyes, which had been clouded with sickness, began to clear, showing glimpses of bright, curious brown. The greatest challenge was keeping the baby quiet. A sudden cough, a fretful cry could expose them. Agnes would hum soft, wordless lullabies learned from her own childhood, songs about the wind and the trees, gentle melodies that weren't prayers but seemed to soothe the infant nonetheless. She learned to anticipate Hope's needs, to quiet her before a full cry could erupt. It was a secret language of whispers and gentle touches, a bond forming in the dark, cold cellar, forged in defiance and desperate love. One particularly cold morning, as Agnes made her hurried trip to the cellar, with a bowl of warm, thin gruel, she paused, her hand on the heavy wooden door. She heard voices. Two sisters, Sister Bridget and Sister Clara, were discussing the next day's baking in the kitchen, their voices carrying clearly through the thin wall. Agnes froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She couldn't go in now. But Hope would. Be hungry. She waited, pressing her ear to the door, listening to their chatter. It seemed to stretch on forever, a mundane conversation that felt like an insurmountable barrier. She imagined Hope, alone in the dark, cold cellar, her tiny stomach aching. The thought was unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sisters moved away, their voices fading as they went to another part of the kitchen. Agnes slipped through the door, closing it silently behind her, plunging herself into the familiar damp darkness. She lit her lamp, its small flame pushing back the shadows. Hope was stirring, a low, fretful whimper escaping her lips. Agnes quickly moved to the barrel, her heart aching with relief and fear. As she knelt, offering the warm gruel, she heard footsteps again, approaching the kitchen. Too close, her blood ran cold. "Sister Agnes, are you still in here?" "Mother." Eldrina's voice, sharp and unmistakable, cut through the quiet of the kitchen, just beyond the root cellar door. "I require your assistance in the scriptorium, immediately." Agnes froze. Her lamp was lit. The gruel bowl was in her hand. Hope, nestled in the barrel, let out another soft whimper. There was no time to hide the lamp, no time to conceal the food. Mother Eldrina was just outside the heavy door, her hand perhaps already reaching for the latch. Agnes looked at the tiny baby, then at the flickering light, then at the closed door. Her secret, their forbidden confession, was about to be laid bare, and with it, the devastating consequences for both her and Sister Martha. The cold stone of the cellar seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the door would creak open and the light of truth and condemnation would flood in.